Welcome back to our Identity Bible Study. This is week 6, and this week we dive into the very fun topic of conflict. Now, once upon a time, God created a beautiful and perfect world filled with creatures of all kinds, filled with unimaginable beauty. Mankind existed in perfect, trust-filled relationship with God and with one another. It was a world where relationships could flourish because everything was built and operating within the design of God. Because of that, mankind could safely interact without fear of being hurt or betrayed. Relationships were steady and eternal. And unfortunately, they just did not remain that way. Beginning with the very first man and woman, Adam and Eve, they chose to step outside of God's direction, outside of God's boundaries and instructions for their life, and sin entered the world. And in that moment, so did shame, and then blame, and then later comparison, competition, war, murder. All these relationship problems that we experience today can be traced back all the way to the Garden of Eden, where relationships were intended and meant to be built on love and trust and by God's design. But we chose another way. We chose the selfish way. And so to this day, our relationships are impacted, and conflict is just part of our human experience. We can't always predict when a conflict is going to happen, but we can bet that conflicts and arguments and misunderstandings and miscommunications and broken trust, they are going to happen to us at some point in life. There's no point in feeling indignant that it's happening to you. It is just, unfortunately, a part of the world that we exist in until God returns and redeems all of this. And so what we have to do, understanding the world that we live in now, is best prepare to respond when conflict happens. There are some things that we can know about ourselves, and there are some things that we can actively do to minimize the damage and even to repair the situation when conflict happens. So that is what today is all about. We're going to look at a couple of things to remember biblically, and then we're going to talk about the natural ways that people tend to handle conflict or disappointment or feelings of frustration. And then we're going to look at how, as many different ways as there are to deal with conflict, there are different approaches that are appropriate in a certain scenario. So we're going to dig into all that today so that you can be best prepared to be a net mender, a bridge builder, a peacemaker, as God has designed and called you to be. I want to start our time today by digging into a couple of biblical principles that we can utilize when we are dealing with conflict. So here are a couple of ways that we can biblically manage conflict and bring about restoration and resolution in relationships as far as we're able to do so. And here's number one. It's keep it real. Guys, unfortunately, the truth is we live in a world that's scarred by the effects of sin. And because of that, it's full of brokenness and full of broken people who cross lines and break commitments and give up because things get hard. Character flaws and addictions rip through some relationships. They tear them apart. And sometimes it's external factors like geographical distance or life experiences that cause people to grow apart or change. Sometimes it's our fault relationships end or are strained, and sometimes it has absolutely nothing to do with us. It's unavoidable, and if it hasn't happened to you yet, just know for certain that it will. In fact, a recent statistic shared that in a lifetime, the average person loses 7 meaningful relationships. Now, while we can't dodge conflict or rejection or hurt, we can control our response to it. We often get stuck reacting to brokenness rather than really doing anything productive about it. We feel surprised or resentful that it's happening to us. So we spend our time blaming other people, feeling sorry for ourselves, obsessively analyzing the situation, or trying to figure out how to inflict the maximum revenge on the offender. while these things are totally normal, we can't stay here and expect anything to change. What we have to embrace as God's people, brokenness and flawed people, it is just the reality of the world that we live in. So there is no point in spending our time being indignant about it and letting ourselves stay in our feelings and reacting to it instead of being proactive, understanding it's a part of life, and having a plan in place to deal with it according to God's heart, God's design, His principles, His character, because we are His ambassadors. And so it is important that in our response to conflict that we reflect His heart. So we approach problems in relationships by saying, this is a part of life. This is not a surprise that this is happening. It happens. And so I'm going to choose to respond intentionally and carefully and biblically and not react. So the second tip I would give you is to drop your weapons. Broken relationships may be the norm in our world, but as Christians, we're called to be in the world and not of the world. And so that means our response, when we talk about developing a response to conflict, our response in relationship failures has to be different than what we see in the world. It is so easy to give in and let anger and defensiveness compel us to do something reckless or sinful, like having a "you're dead to me" attitude, or participating in poisonous gossip, or even being physically violent in some cases. In the moment, it seems like the most justified and rational response, but there's a little passage of scripture that we should probably think about when we think about this kind of retaliation. When God initiates the great breakup between Egypt, who was enslaving God's people, and Israel, God's people, there are some really miraculous things that take place. You find Moses coming to confront the Pharaoh and saying, it's time to let God's people go. And he brings with him this whole skill set of signs and wonders. He promises that there's going to be miraculous intervention. There are going to be these plagues that happen that are God's demonstration that He's serious and that He's real and He wants His people out of there. And so you find Moses coming and announcing these plagues that are happening. And there's something interesting happening on the other side of this confrontation. You find that Pharaoh, the leader, has these magicians that are around him. And in response to Moses and God's miraculous show of power, what you find the magicians doing is replicating the plagues that Moses ushers in. Look, for example, at Exodus chapter 7, when God, through Moses, is turning the Nile River into blood. Now look at verse 22. It says, "But the magicians of Egypt did the same with their secret arts. And Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he did not listen to them." You can find that again in chapter 8. There is a plague of frogs. Moses ushers it in. And again, in chapter 8, verse 7, the magicians did the same with their secret arts, making frogs come up over the land of Egypt. If you step back and think about what's happening here, that's a really interesting choice. Instead of using their ability to make these plagues obsolete, to reverse the impact, they are so consumed with demonstrating their own power that they're just replicating, throwing the same problems back at the people of Israel. So in essence, they are amplifying the problem. They're adding to the problem rather than resolving it. What you find is later in chapter 8, this begins to backfire just a little bit. It says in verse 18 of chapter 8, the magicians tried with their secret arts to bring forth gnats, but they could not. So there were gnats on man and beast. And then later on, you actually see them consumed by the plagues. So this is not a sustainable defense tactic. So I hope you can see that there's a principle here, that when we feel attacked and our response is to replicate what we're feeling, to return what's being thrown at us to another person, That's not a good defense tactic, because if you think about this in the big picture, are they solving the problem? These men could have used their talent, their ability to rectify the problem, to minimize the damage, to stop the plagues potentially. But instead, you see them adding to the problem. They're making more frogs. They're making more blood in the Nile. They're not helping, they're just bringing about more destruction. And we tend to do the same thing. When someone comes at us with aggression and we return with aggression saying, I'm just as powerful as you are, I'm going to defend myself, rather than trying to absorb this and rectify it, respond to it in a way that will bring resolution, we are actually making a greater wake of damage. And that is not what God wants. You see what side of the argument these people are on. These are not people that are aligned with God's will. So there is a time to bring conflict, but when we are approached with something, our response should never be to simply return anger for anger, return ugly words for ugly words, because we're only increasing the problem. We have to respond differently. So in terms of responding to conflict, we need to put down the weapons. What does that mean? That means that we don't need to launch an all-out assault on people when we are frustrated with them. We have to be careful that we don't have this eruption of ugly words, or that we don't begin to launch this very outright direct confrontation, that we are prayerful, that we are careful, intentional, and that we come at a situation, that we confront a person with love in our hearts and a desire to resolve and edify and build up. So you lions, you may really struggle with this. You may just want results, and you may really want to defend someone or a situation. You have to be careful that you are not aggressively attacking people in a way that does not honor the Lord. Even if it's an honorable cause, the way that you go about it does matter. Now, that doesn't let you less confrontational types off the hook, because oftentimes beavers or other types will tend to launch an indirect assault. Rather than going straight to the person, we begin to try to build an army of people who will justify us around us. We begin to talk to people and feel them out about how they feel about a person, or explain what happened and how unfair that was. And so we're beginning to gossip about the person and try to influence the way that people perceive that person. Ancient Jewish rabbis equated this type of character assassination to murder. They talked about it being a breaking of one of the 10 commandments, because you are murdering the character and the way that person is seen within the community. It is absolutely not the way to deal with the problem. If you are on the receiving end of a conversation like this, if someone is having a conflict and they come to you and say, hey, I really need to talk about this situation. I need to process it. I need to know. I need some insight. I need some wisdom, or I need you to pray about this situation. Sometimes people come to us and their intent is really to win us to their side of an argument without us even knowing about it. So if someone approaches you and wants a word of wisdom, wants to vent, wants some prayer, and they begin to talk about a situation with a person, they begin to talk about a conflict with a person, here are some questions to ask yourself if you find yourself in a situation like that. Number one, am I part of this problem? And if the answer is no, then it's probably unlikely that you need to be part of the solution. If there is a conflict happening, the Bible instructs us to go directly to the person who has offended us, to give them an opportunity to explain themselves, and to let them know that there is a problem. So many conflicts would be rectified if we would simply have a conversation, a direct conversation with the person involved, rather than the people who are not a part of it, where we're really just trying to gain support and gain justification for our anger, which keeps us angry, by the way, instead of being brave and being biblical and going directly to the person. Now, when you go directly to the person, it doesn't need to look like a big confrontation. Oftentimes, if we're feeling frustrated, we can begin with clarifying questions. Hey, you said something the other day that I felt some feelings about it. Can I talk to you about it? Can I just ask you some questions maybe about what you meant? Or, I don't understand the decision that you've made to do this. Would you mind explaining to me where you were coming from in making that decision? Sometimes we're upset about things and there's a justified reason, and we're not going to get results by gossiping about people, by talking about them, by creating an army of people to potentially not like them and love you more. So you really have to check your motives if that is your tactic. Be careful that you are responding in a biblical way. And just because you're not fighting with that person doesn't mean that you are responding biblically. There are times where conflict is necessary. And if you're feeling like there's some brokenness in the relationship, most likely the best thing to do is not launch an attack, direct or indirect, but to approach the person in love and say, hey, I value you. I love you. I value our relationship. Let's figure this out because something has gone wrong, and can we talk it out? Do it in a non-threatening way, motivated by love, with the goal of restoring the relationship. You have to remember in a conflict that the person involved in that conflict with you is not the problem. The problem is the problem. So see that person not as a problem, but as a co-laborer in Christ, as someone that deserves respect and dignity and the benefit of the doubt, and just get the conversation going. If you do have the conversation with that person and you don't get resolution, then it's an appropriate time to bring in a third party. So again, if someone comes to you with those types of comments or needs, my advice to you would be take that person directly to the person, connect them, say, hey, how can I help you meet with this person? Instead of engaging in the conversation, my counsel would be, you need to shut it down. Look, I'm not involved in this situation. I will absolutely be praying for you. But my advice to you would be, you need to go have a conversation with them. Can I help you do that? If the time comes, I'd be happy to sit down with you after you talk, but I cannot be a part of this conversation. So that's the mature thing to do. That is the biblical thing to do. Put the weapons down. So now that we've talked about a few ways not to handle our conflict situations, let's talk about something we definitely do need to do every time. There's a scripture that really challenges us with conflict, and that's Romans 12:18. And it says, if possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Now, how can we be at peace with all men if people and their behavior are outside of our control? Well, one big tip to help you is simply to own your own imperfections. It really helps us to extend grace and forgiveness when we stay mindful that we ourselves are sinners, that we make mistakes, that we're not right all the time. And so fostering our humility and remembering our own need for grace is a very important way to motivate ourselves to forgive others, to be a peacemaker with other people. I've so often heard people say, I'm going to forgive, but I'm never going to forget. And they begin to put up walls. And boundaries can be so good, but God calls us to be open. He calls us to be vulnerable, not to abuse, but we are not supposed to be building up these walls that are impenetrable in defense of ourselves. God himself is the defender of our hearts. And so when we begin to set up that post of, I'm going to defend myself, I'm going to be defensive, I am never going to let anyone treat me like this or anyone do this to me ever again. If we become people that are that way, then we're using resources to do something that God says is his job. He is the defender of our hearts. So we do not have to be self-defensive people. I was so challenged recently as I studied Solomon's temple because there's a description of the walls. There are engravings on the walls of this beautifully ornate structure. There are 3 things carved on the temple on the outside, 3 things that God's house, his temple, would have been known for, that would have been symbols of the presence of God. One was the cherubim. These were the guardians of holiness. When the cherubim are around, you know God is around, his presence is there, and they are defenders of that presence and holiness. And we, in the same way as God's temple, are to be defenders of what's holy. We are to be a signal of God's presence. And so we are to live holy lives. There are also palm trees engraved on the temple. And this is really indicative of how we should be, because palm trees are very resilient. Palm trees bear fruit even when there are no resources around. They know how to dig deep in their root system to find life-giving water and to be fruitful. They are found in tough climates, and still, instead of breaking under pressure in storm winds and hurricane winds and drought, they become more resilient. They become stronger even in adversity. And that absolutely is representative of the Christian life, of someone in whom God's presence is dwelling. And the third symbol that is engraved on the walls of the temple is open flower blossoms. And I believe this is because just as powerful and resilient as we are called to be delicate and open. We should be open with people. Only in openness and vulnerability can there be fruitfulness and seed planting. And so we have to remember that. We can't be hardened and closed off with this fortress around our hearts and still be fruitful. This is a step of trust in the Lord. We have to trust that He is going to defend our hearts, that He is going to take care of us, that anything He allows to happen to us is for our development, and we cannot dwell on the possibility of being hurt. We can't let that impede our openness and our willingness to bear fruit and to bear seeds, plant seeds in given situations. So we must be people that recognize our own sinful nature and that recognize that other people are going to share that, and just bear with them. Understand that it's going to happen. Don't be shocked by it, but learn to let some things go. There are some things that you do need to build boundaries around, and we'll talk about that next. But there are a lot of things that happen that we could just simply let go. We could just forgive and overlook, just understanding that people need grace, and in the same way, we need grace. So the fourth tip I want to share with you is about setting limits. We need to set our limits. Boundaries are very important. Now, just a moment ago, we talked about not building up walls and keeping people out, not isolating ourselves, but it is important and appropriate to set limits with people. We should not accept abuse. We should not let people continuously step all over us. We are not, as Christians, called to be doormats. And so I want to give you a couple of suggestions for how to build healthy boundaries into your life. And this is a biblical thing. The scripture tells us to guard our heart. And that is our mind, that's our internal man, our well-being, our feelings, our emotions. We are supposed to steward those things carefully and to take care of our mental, our headspace. We do need to do that. And there are some biblical ways to do that, to best care for ourselves and others, and to preserve relationships in a healthy way. So while we should love and serve other people, we should never ever feel like a slave to their agenda. It's important to set limits with people. You wouldn't leave your locker or your car or your house wide open for anybody to take anything they wanted, and we're not supposed to do that with our mind or our heart. So here are a few examples of setting healthy and biblical boundaries. One is words. Simply let people know when you are confused or when you don't like something. And that is a very acceptable, a healthy way to guard your heart. It's not offensive or wrong to let people know when they've crossed a line. For example, just saying something like, I feel uncomfortable with the way that you're speaking to me right now. Or just asking clarifying questions. I want to understand what you meant when you said that. Could you say that another way? Use your words and indicate if you're feeling a conflict brewing. A second thing we can do is to have consequences. At some point in your life, somebody has probably given you some consequences, probably when you were a child, or if you're a parent, you know that you've set consequences. And that's the old if-then. You can absolutely let people know there is going to be a consequence, an action, if there is a continued behavior that comes about that you feel is harmful to you. For example, a really simple example would be, If you keep standing me up, I'm not going to keep inviting you. That's a very okay way to set a boundary through a consequence. If you continue to be late for dinner, we're not going to wait on you, that kind of thing. A third way that we can create healthy boundaries is through space. There are some times when a conflict gets so intense that the best thing to do is just take a step back. You can set an amount of time and communicate that. You need to communicate that you need a little space and not just completely ghost the person. Set an amount of time to be emotionally or physically distant from a person. And the key really here is letting them know why. Okay, so for example, you can say, I need us to take a week apart to just think things through and pray about what to do next. That's a very simple way, because oftentimes in that time apart, you're able to think clearly and the other person is too, and then you can come together with some solutions. And then a final way that you can help set some boundaries is just to call a friend, phone a friend. Sometimes truth is just easier to receive when you involve a third party. So maybe you need to get a counselor involved. Maybe you need another friend who can help mediate between you. Maybe it's a pastor. It's okay to get help solving a problem. If you're not able to overcome something, when you've gone to that person directly and it just doesn't seem to be changing or helping, it may be time to bring in a third party, and that can be very life-giving to have someone help explain and mediate between the two parties. Proverbs 11:14 actually says, where there is no counsel, the people fall, but in a multitude of counselors, there is safety. You just have to remember, this doesn't mean let me divulge the whole situation to you and slander the person. This is not the kind of phoning a friend that we're talking about. We're talking about bringing in someone who can mediate on behalf of both parties, that has an interest and a care in both parties, that can help bring resolution. That we're not going to dump all of our feelings. We're not going to try to win them over to our side. We're going to invite them into the conversation so that they can help bring about a resolution. We're looking for resolution when we call this person. The Bible just does not call us to be agreeable all the time to the detriment of ourselves. You golden retrievers are probably most guilty of doing that, where you just keep stuffing and stuffing and stuffing your feelings, or maybe even you otters, you don't want to complain because people's approval is very important to you. Don't be afraid to communicate healthy boundaries. There is nothing wrong with using your no. There's nothing wrong with explaining how something is making you feel, because it's very possible that that other person is just different from you and they don't understand the impact that it's having on you. So communicating boundaries, communicating hurts, directly confronting a problem with that person, these don't have to be scary. They can be very life-giving if you know how to do them, and if you know that biblically you are entitled to do these things. The Bible is full of healthy conflict. And so if we begin to look through our scriptures and spend time with some of the flawed characters there, we're going to find that these things happened and we can overcome them through biblical principles. The last tip I would give you for resolving conflict in a biblical way is to simply trust the Lord. Hopefully, as you learn to build some of these practices into your life, you will be able to rebuild broken relationships. You will be able to resolve conflicts. Sometimes, though, even when we do all the right things, they still end. Whatever the outcome, here's the most important thing to remember. God is in control. Scripture tells us that He delights in every detail of our lives and that He wants good things for us. And that means that God has good things in mind for us, even in these hurtful experiences. If you have any doubt of that, you can look to the story of Joseph. He suffered tremendously under the hand of people who should have been most trustworthy, who should have taken care of him, who should have been there for him. His family, his own family, had really let him down. And yet, you see that through a series of painful consequences, he comes to the understanding that God was in it all along. In fact, he says, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive." So even though Joseph had an opportunity to confront and exact revenge on the people who hurt him, he doesn't do that. And Joseph could respond in this way because he found that the broken relationships in his life were vehicles that God used to propel him into the great call on his life. So even if it doesn't feel great, sometimes, or for a time, for a season, God's plan might be for a relationship to end. God may have a better plan for you, or you may need a particular experience in order to develop a skill or a passion within you. And this fork in the road may be exactly the event that sets you on the road to your destiny, just like Joseph. So if you find yourself in brokenness, don't panic. Just don't retaliate either. Do everything that you can to restore and to build bridges. And then you have to trust the Lord with the outcome. You'll find that just like Joseph did, God will use this experience to draw you close, to teach you something, to position you and to prepare you for the purpose that you were born for. So it may be a very important part of your identity to have had this experience. So don't lose heart and don't lose trust in the Lord. He is aware of every experience you're having. And the scriptures tell us that he works all things together for good to those who love him and are called according to his purpose. So don't be discouraged. Just hang on to him and try to respond according to his word within his boundaries, and trust him with the outcome. One of the ways to determine how you prefer to address tense situations or confront or not confront problems in your relationships is through this assessment that you've been provided this week, and that is based on the Thomas Kilmann conflict modes. So it's going to show you what your natural bent is, but one of the things I really like about this resource is that it shows you in one of the handouts you've been given how at any given time all of these can be very appropriate responses. It just depends on the situation. So your handout is going to indicate to you what situations, what criteria make a certain response appropriate. And then you, knowing your preference, can begin to develop the other skills, the other conflict modes as you need to utilize them. And so some of this will be stepping outside of your comfort zone to learn so that you can best bring about resolution in a situation. So there are 5 modes of conflict management that we're gonna discuss today. And the first one is the method of competing or contending. Your handout is gonna call this method the shark. So sharks tend to force others to accept their way. They are oblivious to the needs or feelings of others. Sharks believe conflicts are settled by one person winning and one person losing. So sharks want to win and will do whatever they have to do to win. Their motto might be might makes right. So when we're looking at this conflict style, we have to remember there's kind of a scale of some conflict management solutions are more assertive and some are more cooperative. So the contending or competing method is definitely more assertive and less cooperative. It's win-lose. So if you're doing this, your goal is that you get 100% and the other person gets 0. So it's very power-oriented. You're trying to win. A great example of this that's not a threatening example is athletics. You want to win. There's no middle ground. Somebody's the winner and somebody's the loser. And that's very appropriate for an athletic type contest or situation. So this conflict style is very authoritarian. They use position, power, possessions, or personality to get their way. They're going to try to force it. It's uncooperative. This type of method is best for low trust situations or for situations where there's distance, where you're not going to need to cooperate in the future. There are some unhealthy ways that this can manifest. It's bad when you get to the point where you have 2 people that communicate this way in conflict and they're so worked up that they don't care if everybody loses. Samson in the Bible is a great example of this. He was so angry with the Philistines that he'd lost something that he said, well, if I can't win, you're not going to either. And he sets foxes' tails on fire and destroys their crops. So when it becomes vindictive or revenge-based, everybody's losing at that point. So that's unhealthy. You may want to employ this type of conflict management, and you may win in the short term and lose in the long run. So you have to think about that if you continue to dominate and force your way, that long term your relationships may become distanced. So you can see already how there are some times when this is appropriate and there are some times when it is not appropriate. So number 2 conflict style is collaborating. When we collaborate, and this is called the owl in our assessment, owls confront openly and fairly. They are optimistic about conflict. They are committed to their personal goals and to the goals of others. So owls begin discussion by identifying openly the wishes of both. They find that middle ground, and they are never satisfied until a solution is found that satisfies both. So their motto might be 2 heads are better than 1. When owls talk, they may come on strong, but when you talk, they are listening carefully and sympathetically. So it's very obvious it's not one-sided relationship. When we're looking at our chart, collaborating is very assertive, but also very cooperative. So these types are seeking mutual benefit based on mutual respect. There is cooperation over competition. So everyone wins. Their mentality is that there's plenty for everybody, and one success should not be achieved at the expense of another. Our third type of conflict resolution is the fox, and the fox is a compromiser. So a fox will give up some goals if you'll give up some of yours. So it's not a 100-100 where everyone gets what they want. It's 50-50. The fox is similar to the owl, but less optimistic about conflict bringing an improved relationship. So their motto would be split the difference. In our chart, this one is in the middle because they are finding a mutually acceptable solution that partially satisfies all of the parties. So there's some common interests and some that are not shared, and so there's going to be a give and take involved. Our fourth type of conflict resolution is called the turtle, and this is our avoider. Turtles believe that it's hopeless to try and resolve conflict and avoid people and issues that may cause conflict. The turtle feels helpless in reaching personal goals and refuses to cooperate with others in reaching theirs. So their motto might be leave well enough alone. Turtles neither talk nor listen. You'll seldom get a chance to discuss the issues at all because they just don't talk about them. In our chart here, the turtle refuses to address conflict and withdraws, and so you have it's lose-lose. And see on our chart here, it's unassertive and uncooperative because you're sidestepping without attempting to satisfy either side. So there are times when this can be appropriate as a resolution. If you're giving something time for a set period of time, this may be an appropriate way to handle it. Sometimes you do just need to let it be for a while. So it's not always a bad thing to avoid conflict. If that's the only way that you're ever dealing with conflict, that's a problem because not every situation can be avoided and the outcome be a good one. If you're continuing to be uncooperative and unassertive and you begin to feel resentment, then it's indicating that this is not the right response for you. Because if you keep stuffing your feelings because you're afraid of conflict, that's not an appropriate solution. So you have to be really careful that you're not avoiding just because you hate conflict and that you're avoiding because it's the best option in the given situation. Our last conflict style is called the teddy bear, and it is our accommodating conflict style. The teddy bear soothes. More than anything else, the teddy bear wants others to like and accept them. So teddy bears are quick to accommodate to others and to ignore their own needs because they believe that asking others to meet personal needs will harm the relationship. So their motto would be kill your enemies with kindness. So conflict style with this type, it feels like when teddy bears talk, everything sounds fine. They don't tell you that anything is wrong. And when you talk, they're listening and agreeing with everything that you say. So I think we all know someone in our lives that does that. So this person in our chart is very high in cooperation, but very, very low in assertiveness. So They don't have any standards or demands. They are very quick to please and appease. In a situation where this is important, the relationship is more important than the issue. So this is a classic lose-win. So they are going to satisfy the concerns of others at the expense of their own. And again, just a caution about this. If we begin to feel at any point resentment, or if we're burying our feelings for the sake of harmony in the relationship, this can be very damaging, because over time, this will take a toll on you. There will be sometimes there are physical side effects of not dealing with conflict. You can get sick. There are certainly emotional, psychological consequences of stuffing your feelings and consistently feeling like you're a doormat, or it always being about everyone else. So you have to make sure that this is the ideal solution in this situation, and again, not just a fear of confrontation, because we don't want those negative impacts to begin to infiltrate your life, because that's not healthy for you and it's not healthy for your relationships either. So I hope that hearing about biblical solutions for conflict has been helpful to you, and that you're beginning to identify your own style of how you typically handle conflict. There are some discussion questions for you today to kind of dig into. Maybe there's a situation that you can think of where there was a conflict style that you implemented, but maybe another one would have been better. So take some time to look at your handouts and the appropriate use of each conflict style, and brainstorm a little bit. What could you be doing differently in a conflict you're experiencing right now, or what maybe should you have done differently in the past? Next week is our last lesson. We're going to be talking about developing your testimony. Knowing your story and being ready to share what God has done in your life is so important, and it doesn't have to be overwhelming or scary. And so we're going to talk about a method of sharing your testimony called the elevator testimony, or your 20-second testimony. And when you walk out, you are going to be ready and equipped to share your story and even the gospel with someone that you meet. I'm excited for you to have a tool to share Christ through your personal story where you live, work, and play. So looking forward to next week. Enjoy your conversation today, and praying for you as you navigate conflicts, praying for courage and strength to deal with them in a Christ-honoring way. God bless you, and we will see you next time.